for that to go up at some point if they've received new bills since the last one. So you want to request an updated Medicare lien as close as possible to settlement. Once the final demand has been issued, you want to make sure that you pay it within 60 days to avoid penalties and interest. So the next question is, how do I address future medicals on the case? So a Medicare set-aside report is one of the ways to address future medicals on the case. And it's a report that outlines how much money out of the settlement should be set aside to cover Medicare's interest per the MSP statute in 1980. This amount comes out of the settlement and is not in addition to the settlement. The MSA calculation is based on the most recent 2 years of medical reports and will only include items that are normally Medicare covered. So if Medicare is not able to pay for an item because it's not part of the Medicare program, it's not a covered item, that's something you will never see inside of a Medicare set-aside report. So that report is only going to be the items that Medicare could potentially and accidentally pay for, basically under the MSP statute when it says they couldn't. So the MSA allocation is broken down into two separate categories. It's broken down into future medical treatment that's normally covered by Medicare and prescription medications that are normally covered by Medicare. Those are the two items that are going to go into the Medicare set-aside report. A big one is in-home health care. That's not a Medicare covered expense, so that is not something you would traditionally ever see inside of a Medicare set-aside allocation. Now, I keep referencing the Medicare set-aside allocation. It's the most conservative approach. It's a tested method to cover the MSP statute in terms of future medicals. However, it is not the only option. I worked on a case the other day where an individual was a Medicare beneficiary. They were settling their case. They had an original injury. They recovered from that injury and didn't need any future medical treatment going forward related to the case. They were basically back to normal. They were settling out the case. The medical records all indicated the same thing, that said, hey, this individual doesn't need any ongoing future medical care for this injury. In that particular situation, I provided the attorney with language to put into the settlement documents that addresses Medicare, because you still have to address Medicare, but we didn't recommend looking at any sort of an allocation on that case. We gave them language to put into the settlement documents so that it addresses Medicare and lays out the facts and what's going on. So that if Medicare ever questions it down the road, you have documentation showing you considered their interest and you were reasonable in what you did. That's the big thing here. Medicare likes to use vague language. They say you need to reasonably consider our interest. And that's why you see so much confusion, especially in liability, on how to proceed on these cases, because there's very vague language. There's not a set of rules that you can follow that Medicare has put out. They just go back to the statute and say, hey, if we're not primary, for treatment, you need to cover our interest in the case. So I always like to be clear about that. An MSA is not required by law. It is the safest and most conservative approach you could take. So when should you consider an allocation, or when does Medicare have an interest in your case? So I have a flow card that I'm happy to pass out. If anybody wants a digital copy of it, I can do that. And basically it walks you through the questions to ask about your case to see if Medicare has an interest. So when I say, when should you consider an MSA allocation? That question really is, when does Medicare have an interest in my case, and what should I do? So if the claimant or applicant or plaintiff is currently a Medicare beneficiary, if they've applied for SSDI, which is Social Security Disability Insurance, or in the process of applying for it, if they've applied for SSDI or have been denied and anticipate reapplying, if they are over 62 and a half years of age, that's a big one. So Medicare says if an individual is going to be on Medicare within the next 30 months, you need to consider our interest in the settlement. So at 62, people are traditionally, as long as they've paid into the system, eligible for Medicare Part A automatically at age 65. So 62 and a half, you're 30 months away from being 65. If you're settling a case for somebody 62 and a half or older, you want to do something to cover Medicare's interest in the case. And the last one you want to look at is the monetary value. As you have these cases, when the settlement figures, you start looking at higher settlement figures, higher medical costs on these cases. Traditionally, when you start to see these really large numbers, you have somebody who's significantly injured and possibly critically injured. And, those cases are traditionally going to be the ones where individuals are going to go and apply for disability benefits or are already going to be on Medicare. So everybody likes to think of Medicare as a 65-year-old individual. Applying for Social Security disability is a first step to getting Medicare benefits early. If you apply for Social Security disability benefits and you get accepted, Medicare benefits are coming early. So there's a window, there's a period they make you wait once you get accepted for disability before you become entitled to Medicare. But you can be 34 years old, and if you're injured and you're deemed disabled, you can actually get Medicare benefits early if you've paid into the system. The reason why, say if you've applied for benefits, even if you've been denied and you anticipate that individual anticipates reapplying, as long as they have an open or pending application for disability, Medicare considers them a potential beneficiary. Because if that individual goes through several rounds, they lose, they file for disability, they don't get accepted for it initially, and then they file a reconsideration. Let's say they lose that, then they file an official appeal. If they go through all these steps and get to the end and they go to a hearing and that individual gets accepted, they said, you know what, we messed up. You should have been on disability benefits. In that situation, they will actually, the benefits for disability become retroactive. And in some instances, they will get a check. If this went on for 3 years, they will actually get a retroactive check. So as long as they are in that window and they have an open or pending application, Medicare considers them a potential beneficiary, meaning you want to do something to consider Medicare's interest on your case. So here's part of a flow chart that we have that just kind of outlines the questions we went through and some recommendations there. Again, there's going to be some situations where you might be settling an extremely small case with a minimal amount of future medical care. In a case like that, does it make sense to look at doing a set-aside? Absolutely not. You have to look at the case. You have to decide what your risk tolerance level is. Where are you comfortable? I'm certainly here, to help you work through any of those questions and let you know what I've seen and what's been done on other cases. Again, don't feel like you have to do a set-aside on every case. It's really going to depend on the details of the case. So if you do decide to go the route of having an allocation done, what do you need? You need a completed referral form. The MSA is going to be based off the last 2 years of narrative medical reports on a liability case. The last 2 years of prescription invoices. These are in workers' comp, you have to have them. In liability, they're not required if we're preparing the allocation. And then a payment ledger showing individual TD, PD, and medical payments. Again, that's really work comp only. So you're not going to have necessarily a payment ledger on a liability case. So what's going to happen is the nurses on the case are going to read through the medical reports, pick out those Medicare covered items that are being recommended. They're going to be priced based upon the type of case and what Medicare wants them priced at. So here's some of the differences between comp MSAs and liability MSAs. In a work comp case, the Medicare set aside is going to be priced based upon the state fee schedule. In a liability case, it's going to be priced based on usual and customary pricing, and that's going to be based on the zip code where that individual lives. So it's going to be real world pricing from that zip code. And one of the big differences here between work comp and liability MSAs is liability cases may be apportioned based on the facts and factors of the case. So there's some things you have that come into play on a liability case that don't come into play in a workers' compensation case. For example, on a liability case, you may have a policy limit. You may be settling a case for a Medicare beneficiary and there's a policy limit of $100,000. So let's say we look at the medical records and an MSA is put together and it comes back that this person needs $200,000 in future medical care over their life expectancy. And that's what the report's indicating based on all the records. That individual is getting less than that when they settle their case because of that policy limit. So you can apportion the set-asides based upon some of those factors. And that apportionment method is based upon some court cases where they've ruled in favor of apportionment. So there is no hard and fast document for Medicare on how to portion a case. You really have to look at the court cases involving apportionment when you're dealing with liability cases and liens and liability cases and Medicare set-asides. So let's say you have an individual where in a perfect world, if you went to trial, you won everything you were looking for, the case was worth $1 million based on some other factors, maybe some contributory negligence, maybe some policy limits. These other factors allow you to take that into account with the MSA. So what we would do is we would put together the full MSA, which is the full figure, and we would draft a separate apportionment letter where we use the formula from those court cases to come up with a percentage based upon figures we get from you, including attorney's fees and costs, any Medicare liens that are paid back, the estimated full value of the case. And we use that math formula from those court cases to recommend a percentage of the Medicare set-aside that's been put together be set aside. So, if you have a liability, the big thing with liability cases too is, people are genuinely concerned that, hey, I don't want this Medicare set aside to upset my client. I want to comply with the law, but I don't want it to eat up a vast majority of the settlement. Apportionment is one of the ways that you can address that based upon the facts of the case. We apportion probably 99% of the liability MSAs we do based upon those court cases. And it is reasonable and it's a tested method. So another one of the big differences is CMS approval of the Medicare set-aside allocation and option. In workers' compensation, they have a well-established process. They have some review thresholds that if it's over a certain threshold, it meets this criteria. You can send it in, they'll review it, and they'll issue their stamp of approval on it. In liability, as of today, they do not have an official review process in place. You still have to comply with the MSP statute from 1980. The MSA is one of the ways to address the future medical concerns on the case in terms of Medicare. So what some people will do is say they don't have an official review process, so I don't have to do anything because they'll never look at it. The reality of it is their primary enforcement mechanism is denial of payments. They're gonna know about the case because of Section 111 mandatory reporting I discussed earlier. So you can't really fly under the radar with this. What they will do is they will just deny payments and they will require that individual to use their settlement funds to pay for items before they will ever step in. In workers' compensation, if you completely ignore the future medicals issue, Medicare can assume the entire settlement amount that that individual received is their future medical fund. And unless they spend all of it on future medical treatment and prove that they spent it all appropriately, Medicare will not step in and pay for case-related items going forward. The beauty of this whole process is if you address Medicare's future concerns on the case, and let's just say you've established a set-aside, you have documentation about what is case-related and what goes in there, what happens is, if let's say you set aside $10,000 for treatment and that individual runs through that $10,000, it's all handled appropriately per Medicare's guidelines and it's exhausted, Medicare will then step in and become the primary payer for those items. So that is the protection long-term. If you do absolutely nothing for an individual who has Medicare benefits and you're settling the case, Medicare can assume, you look to comp because that's the closest thing that they have. They can assume the entire amount that individual received to put in their pocket is their future medical funds, and they will not be the primary payer for those items until they spend all of that money. So it's a much better option to set aside a piece of those funds to address Medicare, make sure they're administered properly, those MSA funds, and then have that option there for that individual. Now, if you're going to apportion the Medicare set-aside down, it's even more important that those funds are handled properly because it is going to exhaust before that individual's life expectancy is up. So these MSAs are based upon the life expectancy of the individual. If you are saying based upon the policy limits and other stuff, we're going to set aside 20% of a full Medicare set-aside amount projection that we had put together, that money is going to run out before that life expectancy on that case. So it's very important to make sure that the funds not only are there and they're used properly, but that all the accounting, all the guidelines are followed from Medicare on what is supposed to happen with the Medicare set-aside funds. So again, what happens with those funds? There's two options. They can be set up in a custodial account, which is professional administration. It's commonly referred to as professional administration. That's where a company is hired to manage the individual's MSA funds per CMS's guidelines. They're responsible for ensuring all compliance, handling all reporting to Medicare. They deal with all the providers. They negotiate pricing. And if there is any issues, they also coordinate with an individual's private health insurance. So if they're being seen for multiple things, maybe case related and not case related, they work with those providers to make sure the bills go to the right place. That's one of the things, in addition to doing Medicare set-asides, that we've been doing, and that's really where Medivest started as a company, is as a professional administrator. Our unique position with this is that we've been handling funds for over 20 years for individuals. So we see these issues that traditionally, once a case settles, most people don't see. You know, the denial of benefits, the refusal to pay by, you know, maybe a private insurance plan, or Medicaid or Medicare. So we step in the middle of that and make sure the bills are going to the right places. So the other option for the MSA funds is self-administration. And that's where the individual manages their own MSA funds per the Medicare guidelines. The duties and obligations with those funds are exactly the same, whether it's professionally administered or if it's done by an individual. If you have a set aside done on a case and that individual insists on handling their own MSA funds and they want to assume that risk, let me know. I have language that you can provide to them where they sign. It basically states that they are aware what they have to do with the funds. It's CMS issued. So, you know, they can read through it. It tells them everything they're supposed to do. And there's a spot for them to sign at the bottom. So it's proof that you've gone over it with them. So if they mismanage their funds, you know, it's proof that they can't come back to you and say, hey, you didn't address, as my attorney, you didn't address this with me. So I have that language. I'm happy to give it to you for free if anybody wants it. I'll let myself or Mary know, and we'll get that to you. I can tell you 80% of people who self-administer their MSA funds mess it up in the first 5 years. And what they're doing is jeopardizing their long-term Medicare benefits for those body parts. So CMS's latest work comp reference guide states that they highly recommend professional administration. They realize they're negotiating better pricing for those individuals with the providers. It makes the MSA funds last longer. It stretches them out. It's a protection, a long-term protection for Medicare too. And they do say in the manual, although beneficiaries may act as their own administrators, it's highly recommended that settlement recipients consider the use of a professional administrator for their funds. So that's the first time that they've ever come out and endorsed it. Yeah, one of the things most people want to know is, okay, what do I have to do with these MSA funds? So the funds must be placed in an interest-bearing account, and annually you have to provide a self-attestation letter to Medicare. If there's a professional administrator involved, they are responsible for providing that documentation. They do say back in 2004, when they were originally discussing this, the funds must be administered by a competent administrator. A person may self-administer his or her own MSA funds, but all the rules and regulations are the same. The professional administrator must forward annual accounting statements to CMS to allow them to track the file. A self-attestation letter is required for self-administered MSAs. Attorneys' fees and administration fees cannot be charged to the MSA account. The additional income tax on interest income earned on the MSA may be charged to the MSA account. So if this isn't an interest-bearing account, that individual earns some interest on that account. It's just like anything else. There is a tax liability for that. A professional administrator, is going to provide all the documentation necessary so that that individual can file it with their taxes and make sure everything is paid up there, so there's no tax liability once that's done. Upon the death of the claimant or the applicant or plaintiff, the funds may be dispersed pursuant to state law. However, this may involve holding the account open 15 to 27 months. That's a Medicare issued directive. Typically what happens is if you're administering a file and that individual passes away and there's funds left in there, in the agreement for administration, the individual designates a beneficiary. So in most cases we have, if somebody passes away and there's funds left over, we typically have to hold that account open for usually it's about 2 months to allow for any unpaid bills. Because if there's a date of service prior to that individual passing away and that bill comes in after they have passed away and we've released the funds per the agreement to the beneficiary, you're going to get into some issues about who's responsible for that payment, because technically when the service happened, the administrator was responsible for payment. There is two things that can happen when the MSA funds are being professionally administered. They can be temporarily exhausted. Basically, that means that there's a structure in place to fund the Medicare set aside, and when that structure is in place, let's say that individual has a really bad year, and the MSA is funded with a seed money from that structure, and that money's gone, and the next annuity payment hasn't come in to fund the Medicare set aside for that particular year. If those funds are exhausted, that's temporary exhaustion. If that happens, the administrator notifies CMS. We provide all the documentation. Medicare will step in and pay the bills for those case-related items until the next annuity payment comes in, and they do not require you to reimburse them. So again, it's all about making sure that you can prove you spent the funds appropriately. If you have a file that's set up, there's no structure involved, and the MSA was, say, $10,000, and all those funds have been spent appropriately, and now they're completely gone, and that individual is still alive, then you would notify Medicare that the file has been permanently exhausted. They'll look into the file, make sure everything was paid appropriately, and then they will step in as the primary payer on the case. Misuse of the MSA funds can jeopardize the claimant's Medicare eligibility until the funds have been reimbursed. If that individual makes mistakes with that money and Medicare looks into the file, audits it, what they're going to do is they're going to say, okay, you messed up on this amount right here, and until you put that back out of your own pocket and use it appropriately, we will not step in as the primary payer. So we're almost done here. I'm trying to be quick and get us out of here by 5. In terms of the benefits of professional administration, and this is really, everybody spends a lot of time figuring out what the dollar figure is to cover Medicare's future interest. Where everything gets sideways is post-settlement on the administration side of things, especially when an individual is going to handle it themselves. The benefits to having a professional administrator is they are financially responsible for that account. If there's any issues with Medicare, they are responsible for coordinating those issues. The administrator is going to communicate with doctors, pharmacists, and medical equipment vendors to ensure proper billing and payment for goods and services, make sure they're not being overcharged for those items, make sure that the MSA funds are paying for items that should be paid for out of the MSA fund and not unnecessary items. They're going to negotiate fees for medical services, surgeries, and hospitalizations to stretch out those funds. They're going to prepare the annual compliance documents and reports to Medicare. And again, they're responsible for protecting Medicare entitlement long term.